Good morning, everyone. I have to say I was not in the mood 15 minutes ago that I'm feeling I am now, or my energy was in a different place, hearing this affirmation on power, and then brave were the people, and then Greg's reading. It's sort of like, okay, let's go. This is really a wonderful reading that we have this morning for so many reasons. It's so clearly there for everybody, no matter where you are on this path. Maybe the operative words are on this path, meaning on a spiritual path, because of course to even begin to understand these teachings, one would have to be open and aware spiritually. But as Sharmila read, this is the first of the Beatitudes. You know, it comes right out of, or right at the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And even the way that sermon is talked about often, it sort of says, Jesus was there and he looked out at the multitudes. And you just get the feeling of Jesus looking out and he sees everybody there. And then it says, and then he basically turned and ascended the mountain, and his disciples followed. It's a very interesting saying. It's not in the reading this morning, but he didn't say that he chose people. He didn't say, you come with me and you come with me and you're ready and you come with me. The disciples followed, meaning the very first time we get to hear, in a way, for those who had ears to hear, for those who were his true disciples, who knew that they were going to climb that mountain with him and hear the truth. And it was a very poignant time in his life. Jesus came, he was really speaking about love and humility. He was laying down, some people say, the very tenets of what would become Christianity with these Beatitudes, saying, here are the qualities, the characteristics of those people who will attain the kingdom of heaven. And the very first one, of course, is those who are poor in spirit. And Sharmila read some of Swamiji's comments, but I think in the expanded version of those comments, Swamiji makes it very clear that what Jesus was referring to was those people who could move away from their sense of self, who could lay down their ego. They would attain the kingdom of heaven. Then we have this talk, the title of which is Ego, Friend or Foe. And before I read what Swamiji wrote, I was preparing earlier this past week for the first of a series of classes called Akash that Swamiji wrote in 2011, I believe. Ancient Keys for Attaining Success and Happiness. And I was just, when I was reading and looking for stuff about the ego to talk about that first night, as I was introducing the class, many people are teaching in it, but I was going to be just giving that first little talk. I was looking at the title of the talk for this week, and it came to me. I said to myself, that's not a good question to ask. But then, of course, it was Swamiji, so I had to back up and get myself out of the way. But I thought, no, it's really, it came to me just in a flash that the ego is both. And I had no idea what that meant. But when Swamiji wrote Akash, or actually the piece that preceded it, which was called Material Success Through Yogic Principles, he wrote a 26 lesson series or workbook, really, that he intended for people to study over the period of a year, one lesson every 2 weeks. And it turns out those lessons are, profound doesn't say it, they are really a working text on how to live this life, our lives, on the spiritual path. They're not easy to read, and they're not easy to understand. They are deep. They are everything we need to know. And I went to that source because Akash, which turned out to be a 6-week course, because it was not easy for people to study for a year, Swamiji said these principles are so important. I'm going to write a 6-week version, and you, he said to all of us, to everybody, take them out and teach them everywhere, over and over. You should come, you should take the class once, then you should go out and teach it yourself. This is literally what he was saying to the people in India at the time. I mean, the Ananda people. But just keep, sort of like the old medical adage of see one, do one, teach one. They don't give you much training. You hear the class once, get out there and teach it. But he was saying it because these principles are so important. But before he got to the principles, Swamiji spent the first 4 lessons of material success saying to all of us, why are these lessons even important? Why am I doing this? Why am I laying it out for you? And he talked in a beautiful way about the moment that the ego is formed. He went on in those chapters to talk about karma, reincarnation, right attitude, saying to everybody who would study these, here's why I'm going to then speak to you about something as simple as honesty, as truthfulness, as integrity, as kindness, because these are the spiritual qualities. These are the ancient keys that he's talking about. But before that, he just laid the groundwork so beautifully so that anybody who picked it up can see, oh, this is what's going on with my soul. And I can't share all of that with you right now, but I'm telling you all this so I can share the piece that I want to share. This is what's happened, he says. This is why you need to hold these qualities right up front. You need to keep coming back to them in order to be able to go on and attain success and happiness. That's the title of the course. So here we are. We all know we're talking about ego today. And most of us, at least, have heard many times Yogananda's definition of the ego, which is the soul identified with the body. Now, I'm about to reveal something about myself that is a little embarrassing. I've been on this path many years. Only last week, when I was preparing for that class, did I get, in a very meaningful way, that the ego is the soul. And I just always held it, that once that soul identified with the body, something else happened. And that something else was the ego. And it was separate in my mind. And I've carried it all of these years. Something to outgrow, something to turn away from, something to transcend. But only last week did it come to me, the ego is the soul. And in that way, now all of you might be sitting out there, and forgive me if you are, saying, why is she saying that? Of course, we've always known that. Maybe you all always got it. But it really hit me in a different way that the ego has within itself all of those soul qualities, all of that soul's yearning to be back, to go home. The ego's not out here it is doing its own thing, and it's doing it extremely well, as we all know, and with great force. You know, I never know which affirmation we're reading when I'm giving service. I probably should pay attention to it, but I don't. It's not usually what I'm going to talk about. But when Chidambar started reading today, I thought, and I've said this before, sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's so clear why Swamiji chose that affirmation, because the ego does what it does so well. If we want to move on this spiritual path, we better know about what real power is, or it will just hold us. But it remembers. It's very much like what Asha was saying last week, and she just said it so beautifully. At that moment when the ego is formed, even Swami says elsewhere, before there's an embryo, the minute the egg and sperm come together and that soul descends, that being, that part of that soul has its attention drawn elsewhere. It's no longer looking at this infinite consciousness that it was just an instant before a part of. All of its attention now is focused out in an instant before there's an embryo. And Asha said last week, our attention's elsewhere. We forget where we've come from. What is the word she used? She said, we, right that instant, begin to feel incomplete. It was such a perfect word. Yesterday during our family service, let's see, I don't see Simone here, but Simone came to our family service yesterday with her daughter who, I don't know, maybe she's 7 months old, maybe 8 months, 9? 9. She's absolutely this beautiful little being. I mean, she is a beautiful child, but energetically too, and she's got these huge eyes. But she's little, and Mom always keeps her in one of those little wrappy things, and she was sitting over here. The minute Tandava started playing music, I mean, anybody who was there knows, the minute she started squealing and screeching and throwing her little arms around, it was so precious. Then we would do a little something, and she would sort of get quiet again. Then Tandava would play more music, and she just came out like, there it is. Wait a minute, where did that go? I felt the whole time we were here that she was recognizing something. She was just too many months near it. I was looking at her. She was delighting all of us. And there was a little bit of me that was saying, oh, I'm so sorry that might leave her. I hope it doesn't, but it was just so delightful. We feel incomplete. And I felt that she was having a moment of feeling completed again. The ego comes in and it overrides the soul. It masquerades as the soul for us. And in a way, as I said, it is the soul. It turns us in a different direction, not that far. You know, it reminded me when I was thinking about all this yesterday of these stories that we hear of people who go out hiking. And for any of you who have hiked, and I've done a lot of it in my life, I can always see how this happens. They get turned around. They can't find where they are. They just keep looking at a trail and they think, that looks familiar. Okay, I'll go there. Then they go there and they go, no, this isn't it. And then they try and retrace their steps. And of course, in the most tragic of circumstances, and we've all heard this, people are found dead 100 yards or 100 feet from where they were trying to get to a place of warmth and food and sustenance and whatever it is that would have saved their lives. They just were that close, but they couldn't find their way. Because the more we turn this way and the more we're mesmerized by all of what's out there, the more we're drawn in by that ego. And the more the ego does what it wants to do, it becomes a vortex of energy that is really inescapable. That's why we're all here. That's why everybody in this room, maybe you wouldn't use the word suffering to describe your life. Maybe some of you would. Maybe some of you think, well, life isn't bad, but I really get it. I'm longing for something. But whatever you would call it, you're here because there is something else. Because whatever it is we've been doing until now, we continue to feel incomplete. We are beginning to know that we have been cut off from the main source of that which can sustain us. And we're just drawn out here by this vortex of energy that says, no, come on down here. It's really all about you and you being happy and you finding what you want. And just like our festival says, you keeping it all to yourself. And it focuses us on the most minuscule piece, this petty little piece of what is infinite in reality. But the ego gets us. And as I was saying before, boy, does it do a great job of it. It fools us at every moment. It is so alluring, so powerful, that we find ourselves wrapped up in this I, me. But what about my family? Look at the family I came into. Look at the job I have to do. Look at this boss I have to work with. I have that little song, which I don't know, but that Swamiji wrote, I, my, me, mine, just kept playing through my head last night. Of course he wrote the song, because we don't like to think of ourselves like that. And of course, almost all of us, I imagine, if not all of us, we're good people. We're not obviously selfish and doing bad things, but we can't help but be. It's so subtle. This is why there are all of these amazing stories, none of which I'm going to tell right now, but if these people who are sitting there just talking with God, that's how evolved they are, Narada and other saints. So God says to Narada, go get me a drink of water. And what happens? He goes into the village, he falls in love, he has a family. The question he was just asking God is, how can that happen? How can people be so fooled? Or the saint whose name I'm blocking on right now, who was sitting in the room with another saint who had a stick, right? And the saint came over and smacked him with the stick. And the saint whose name I'm forgetting, if anybody remembers it, just Namdev. Yeah, that's exactly right. Gets all indignant. How could you do this? I'm your equal. And the other saint says, a crack in the pot have we, because he was a potter. He used to use this stick to test his pots. And then Namdev says to Krishna, why are you doing this to me? How could you insult me? Krishna says, you have to go and find your guru. Namdev says, but I look for you all the time. That's all I do. I wasn't going to tell this story, but obviously I'm telling it. It's a good story. And he says, no, you have to go find your guru. And he says, well, where is he? And he directs him. And I am going to shorten the story. But he finds, ultimately, he's led to this man who's dressed in rags, who's laying up on the dais, whose feet are resting on a Shiva lingam. The Shiva lingam is such a sacred object. You wouldn't even point your feet. It represents Shiva, the whole aspect of creation in the world, something so divine. And Namdev is just appalled. This is the man that Krishna sent me to? So he takes his feet. He yells at the man. He berates him. And he moves his feet. But he does this 3 or 4 or 5 times, and everywhere he places the man's feet, a Shiva lingam appears under him. And then he gets it. This man already knows the truth. God is everywhere, in everything. And he wanders around for months and finally finds himself back in the same little temple where he started. And Krishna comes and says, where were you? You used to talk to me every day. You used to come and pray and ask me to come to you. Where have you been? And he says, Master, you can't fool me now. I know you're everywhere. And then Krishna says, now there is no crack in the pot. But you see, the purpose of these stories are to say to us, even these extraordinarily highly evolved souls get caught up in any little last bit of ego that's there. But here comes the good news. We're not all just on this downward spiral. You remember Paramhansa Yogananda said, God sleeps in the minerals. He dreams in the trees and the plants, dreams in the plants. I'm going to lose I don't have it here. What does he do in the animals? He begins to wake and is fully awake. Yeah, it's not exactly his words. He begins to wake, but anyway, he starts getting a little more restless and apparent in the animals. Let me just say that. There is a word that he used, and he awakens in human beings. And why is that? That's such a beautiful little sequence that he shows us. What separates us from the animals who are not that far behind us? They're not that many incarnations ago. What separates us really is the ego. This is the way that the ego can play the role in helping us attain true success and happiness. This is the friend part now. That thought that I had that just ran through my mind last week, well, it's neither or it's both, was exactly right, though I didn't have any of the words for it at the time. But it is a friend because it's what allows us to realize that we're suffering and to care about it. We don't just have an instinctive reaction to suffering and pull into our shell or draw a leg in or fly away. We start realizing, might take us many lifetimes, but we actually are given the ability now as human beings with this ego that is still a part of the soul. Wait a minute, this is a lot of suffering. And once we decide in our lives that we are committed to ending that suffering, once we say, I really want to move away from all of this self-indulgence, this self-awareness, this self-promoting, this I, my, me, mine, that is always there. I heard a wonderful little saying talking about the ego when I was reading about the ego. I don't know who said this. Winston Churchill. I don't know who quoted him. Winston Churchill stood up one day and he said, oh, I believe we're all worms. He said, I just think I'm a glowworm. How hard the ego will struggle to hold onto itself. But once we begin to awaken, and once we say, no, I've had enough of this. I'm going to put all of my energy, all of the power that it takes, all of the bravery, all of what we heard about earlier today, and I am going to turn my attention back towards the light. I am going to do everything I need to do to remember I am not this ego. I am not this tiny, tiny little bundle of energy. I am the infinite. I have all of that in me. And we'll have to work at it, and we'll slip back, but eventually we start feeling the power of the infinite source coming down to get us. Because here's the other thing about this. That specific task, program, job, presence that was designed just for us to accomplish in this life. And it is that way with that little individualized bit of ego. Were any of you here for the Krishna Kirtan on Friday night? It was so wonderful. But I said to a couple of people, as I've said before, Raghu was born to do this. There were many other great musicians up here, but you just get the feeling Raghu came in to chant, to lead Kirtan. And you've had that feeling about other people at other times. But that cannot happen for us until we begin to align ourselves with infinite consciousness, until we open ourselves up and say yes, which is the invitation for God to come and work with us. In a way, it's exactly what happened with Jesus' disciples when I said before, he just turned and ascended the mountain, and the disciples followed. And that was them saying to him, I'm here, I'm with you, I get it, work with me. This is exactly what I want, where I want these teachings. Ultimately, self-realization, ultimately this path we're on, is exactly that process of doing everything that we need to do to move away from our ego, to open into the infinite, to reclaim our birthright. I heard, who was it? Maria McSweeney said something very wise at some talk or sermon of hers. She was explaining why it is important to memorize the poem Samadhi, which Master said we should all do. It's a poem that's back there on the wall. It's not easy. It's not an easy poem to even read and get, because the whole poem is about soul realization, soul consciousness. It has nothing to do with ego consciousness. And it's very hard for us to make that leap. But she says, in this struggle, this battle that we're going to fight to get out of our ego, if we read Samadhi every day, even though we may not have had that experience, most of us probably haven't, it speaks to our soul. It speaks to that place within us that remembers. It speaks to whatever Imaya was squealing about yesterday. Our soul does that too. Oh yeah, that's where I want to be. Something starts remembering and awakening. And it brought to me, I've never memorized Samadhi, but it really inspired me to do that, or to at least start reading it. Because I was thinking, how do we do this? If it's so subtle, how is it that we begin this battle? That one other thing that came to mind that I'll share, and I'll just close with this. Sri Yukteswar, I'm so terrible at remembering these quotes when I'm up here. They're there and I know them. But he basically said, as long as we're breathing the free air of this earth, then we are obligated to render grateful service. Those are the three words that he used, render grateful service. And as I was thinking about this whole topic of the ego, I realized that, and this is something Swamiji said, by the way, in the material success class. He says there's two ways for the ego to be free. One is just to sit down, deny your ego, get into your spine, and be back with God. How many of us could do that? It's hard. Even one of our readings during the year from the Gita, where Krishna is saying, that's too hard for most people. Why don't you take these other steps? Well, what Swamiji points out in the material success class as one of those other steps is beginning to feel more compassion, more empathy. He calls it sympathizing with. But I think what he meant was compassion, empathy, opening your heart to other people. Why would he be telling us to do that? Why would Sri Yukteswar be saying, render grateful service? Because as we open our hearts, as we begin to see other people, see the divine in them, want to serve them, we begin to see with greater and greater ease and to know that everything and everyone in this world is an expression of the divine. So if we could do nothing else, if we have trouble meditating or trouble ridding our mind of negative thoughts, which could mean jealousy, anger, all of those things I was talking about earlier. Why do I have this family? Why did this happen to me? Why did that happen to me? If in that moment we step out of ourselves and we serve somebody else, we just do some simple act of giving or serving, it opens up that channel through which the ego can really be dispelled and we can take ourselves back to the ego's origin, which is a part of that infinite soul, the whole goal of this path we're on, by doing something as simple as rendering grateful service. What beautiful words, what a wonderful gift he gave us by saying, just serve God in everyone and you will find yourself home. So yes, the ego it's our foe. If we let it go, it's going to take us right out into the world, and it's going to, as Devarshi said, just keep dangling all these beautiful little colored balls and temptations, but it's also our friend. If we say, let me pay attention to it, let me feel its suffering, let me use that suffering and turn it all around, because within me lies the power to do exactly that.